Later, half the city of Corin would swear they had seen it coming. They would say it over their cups, wisely the way people always do once a thing has already happened and cost them nothing. Of course, he was never going to choose the tracker. Of course not. A king takes a queen, and a queen comes with a border, an army, a treaty, a name you can carve into stone, and they were right, in the end, which is the infuriating part. But not one of them had been standing in the great hall that morning. Not one of them had seen the way the king looked at Ilva before he opened his mouth. If they had, they would have kept their wise little mouths shut for the rest of their lives. Ilva had not wanted to be there at all. She had said so plainly, 3 separate times, to 3 separate people who outranked her, which was very nearly everybody. She was a tracker. Her work happened in ditches and pine stands, and the wet gray hours before dawn, and it happened alone, and that was the entire reason she was good at it. She had the best nose in the realm, and the worst manners in the palace, and she had made her peace with the trade long ago. But the choosing was the choosing. Every wolf, sworn to the crown, stood in that hall. Even the ones who smelled like riverbank and horse. So she stood at the back, in her good gray coat, with her hands behind her and her heart going far too fast for a woman who was only there to watch, because he had told her to wear it. That was the thing she kept turning over, all through the horns and the long, boring procession of banners. 9 days ago, in the dark of the North Stair, with his forehead against hers and his hands cold for the first time she could remember, Ruvan had said, "Wear the gray one, whatever happens, wear it so I can find you." At the time she had laughed at him, she had asked him whether the king of all Austria truly could not pick a woman out of a crowd without a color scheme. He had not laughed back. That should have been her first clue. And she had missed it the way you miss a step in a dark house, which is to say, completely and all at once. The hall filled. 2,000 wolves, shoulder to shoulder under the high windows, and the light came down in long white columns, and the air was thick with the scent of every noble house in the kingdom, trying very hard to smell important. Ilva could have named them all with her eyes shut. She usually did, for entertainment. Then the horns went quiet, and Ruvan came out onto the dais, and every wolf in the hall bent at once, and the pressure of it went through her like a hand on the back of her neck. She had never got used to that. 5 years in his service, and she had never once got used to it. The others said an Alpha King's presence pressed down on you. It had never pressed down on Ilva. It pulled. It reached into the middle of her chest and pulled, and it had been doing it since the first night she met him, when he was 23 and freshly crowned and hopelessly out of his depth. And she was a half-wild girl from the Pine Country who had been hauled into his study to explain how she had tracked a poacher 40 miles through running water. He had listened to her that night for 2 hours. Nobody had ever listened to Ilva for 2 hours in her life. Now he stood above 2,000 people with a circlet on his head and his jaw set like a man walking into a fire, and he found her at the back of the hall in her good gray coat, exactly as he had said he would. He did not smile. That was when the first cold thread went through her. Chancellor Ozias stepped forward with the scroll. He was a small, tidy, pleasant man, and he had a voice built for large rooms, and Ilva had never liked him for reasons she had never been able to put a finger on, which annoyed her because she could usually put a finger on anything. He read the terms, the choosing of a queen by the ancient right of the Alpha King, freely and before witness, binding until the last breath of the last of them, and so on, and so on. It went on for some time. The crown liked its own voice. Then Ozias lowered the scroll and said the only line that mattered. Name her. The hall went so quiet that Ilva heard a bird land on the roof. She was not expecting anything. She wants that on the record, whoever is keeping it. She had never once let herself expect anything. She was a tracker with no house, no land, no name worth carving, and she had been sleeping in the king's bed for 2 years, and telling herself every single morning that this was a warm thing that would end, the way warm things do, and that she would be dignified about it when it did. She was not expecting anything, and yet her whole body leaned. Traitor that it was, it leaned toward him across 2,000 people, and her heart came up into her throat, and for one white, weightless second, she let herself have it. She let herself hear him say it. Ruvan's eyes did not leave hers. He said, "Adali of Severin." The hall made a sound like water breaking over stone. Somewhere to her left, a house steward began to weep with joy, because that is what house stewards are for. Adali herself came forward through the crowd, and she was lovely, and she was young, and she looked as frightened as a deer in a market square, and she had done absolutely nothing wrong in her entire life. Ilva stood very still. She found, distantly, that she was still watching his face. She had spent 5 years learning to read things that did not want to be read. Trails, bloodstains, weather, men. And what she saw on the king's face, in the moment the hall erupted, was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not even the mild, pleasant nothing that kings wear like a second coat. It was grief. He looked, for 1/2 of 1 second, like a man watching his own house burn down with someone still inside it. Then it was gone, and the mask came down so smoothly that she almost doubted she had seen it, and Adali of Severin was climbing the steps of the dais to stand beside the Alpha King of Austria. Ilva turned to go. She got 4 steps. She was good at leaving rooms. It was the one social skill she had ever bothered to master. Then his voice came across the whole length of that hall, and it stopped her, the way a blade stops a rope. Ilva. 2,000 people turned around. She could feel every one of them. She could feel the whole hall swing toward her like a door on a hinge, and she stood there in her good gray coat, in the middle of an aisle of strangers, and she made herself turn back and look at her king. He was looking straight at her. He had not moved. Adali stood at his elbow, forgotten. And Ruvan said, loudly enough for every soul in that hall to hear it, and slowly enough that not one of them could pretend later that they had misheard, he said, "You may go." He said it the way you dismiss a hound. He said, "Whatever you imagined you were, you may stop imagining it now. You are a warm thing on a cold road. You were never more than that, and you will never be more than that, and I will not have you standing at the back of my hall looking at me like a woman who has lost something. There is nothing here that was ever yours." He said, "Go home, Ilva." And then, because apparently the gods felt the wound wanted salt in it, he turned back to Adali of Severin and offered her his arm, and the hall roared its approval, and nobody in that entire kingdom looked at Ilva again. She has thought about those 30 seconds every day since. She has taken them apart, the way she takes apart a trail. She has looked for the one thing that did not fit, because there is always one thing that does not fit, and in 5 years of turning it over, she has found only this. His hands were shaking. The Alpha King of Austria, who had once held a wolf twice his size against a wall by the throat, without changing expression, stood on his own dais and told the woman in his bed that she was nothing, and his hands were shaking so badly that he had to close them. She did not weep in the hall. She wants that on the record, too. She walked out through 2,000 people with her chin up, and her face doing absolutely nothing at all, and the crowd opened for her, and closed behind her, and somewhere in the middle of it, she passed Chancellor Ozias, who was standing at the edge of the aisle with the scrolls still in his hands. He inclined his head to her just slightly, the smallest possible courtesy, and he was smiling. She thought about that afterwards, too. Adali of Severin caught her in the west corridor. Ilva had not expected that, and Ilva did not enjoy being surprised. The girl came out of a side door with her skirts in both hands, and her guards 10 paces behind her, and she stood in front of the woman she had just displaced, with her chin up and her eyes enormous. "Please," Adali said. "Please, listen." Luba looked at her. She looked at the future Queen of Austria, 17 years old, in a dress that cost more than the Blue Martin would later cost, and she took one breath through her nose, the way she had taken 10,000 breaths in her life, and read her the way she read everything else. And what she smelled was not triumph, it was terror, cold and metallic and absolute, coming off the girl in waves, the scent of an animal in a snare that has stopped struggling because it has understood the snare. "I didn't want this," Adali whispered. "You have to know that I didn't. They came to my father in the spring, and they told him. Then a hand closed on the girl's arm, very gently, and Chancellor Ozias said, "My lady, the hall is waiting." Ilva did not move, neither did Ozias. He was a head shorter than her, and he looked up into her face with the same small pleasant courtesy he gave to everyone, and he said, "You have had a hard morning, tracker. Go and rest." And Adelie of Severin was steered away down the corridor, without another word, and she looked back once, and her face was white. Ilva stood there for a moment. Something in her, the old, cold, professional thing that had never once been wrong, lifted its head and said, "That girl is not a bride. She is a hostage." And then Ilva, who was the best tracker in the realm, who could follow a 4-day trail through running water, who had never in her life failed to notice the one thing that did not fit, told that voice to be quiet. Because she was 28 years old, and she had just been called a warm thing on a cold road in front of 2,000 people, and she did not have one single scrap of anything left to give to the problems of a king. She has thought about that too, every day. For 5 years, her room was in the North Tower, 4 flights up, because she had asked for the one with the window that opened. It took her 11 minutes to pack it. That is the part that undid her in the end. More than any of the rest of it. 2 years in a king's bed, 5 years in a king's service. A whole life, and it fit in one satchel, with room left over for bread. She took her knives. She took her coat. She took the little brass compass her father had left her, which did not work. She left the pearl combs. She left the green dress. She left the book of northern maps he had given her on her birthday, with the note still inside it that said, "For the only person in this castle who knows where anything actually is," and she stood over that book for a long time, and then she put it back on the shelf and closed the lid of the satchel. The bond went out at moonrise. She was on the tower stair when it happened. It did not fade. It did not thin. It was there, that low, warm weight, under her ribs that had been there for 2 years, the one she had never once said out loud, because saying it would have made it a claim, and she had no right to make claims. She went down on the stone, like she had been hit. She could not breathe. Something enormous and quiet tore straight out through the center of her chest and did not come back, and she lay on the 4th landing of the North Tower, with her hands over her heart, and made a sound she has never made before or since. Only 2 things in this world can cut a bond, like that, a death, or the wolf on the other end of it, choosing to. So she got up. That took a while. And then she went down the rest of the stairs, and out through the kitchen yard, and past the gate guard who knew her, and let her through without a question. Because Ilva went out at strange hours, that was simply what Ilva did. She did not leave a letter. There was nothing to say that he had not already said in front of 2,000 people. She did not say goodbye. She rode north out of Corin in the last of the dark, and she did not look back at the towers. Not once, because she knew exactly what looking back would cost her, and she had already paid quite enough that day. 9 days later she was on the high road above the pine country, and she stopped to water the horse at a stream, and she went down on her knees, in the wet grass, and was violently, comprehensively sick. She sat back on her heels. She wiped her mouth. She looked at the water for a long moment. Then she counted back the weeks, and then, very carefully, she counted them again. 5 years later, in a border town called Little Maybury, the finest nose in the realm was being used to determine whether a 4-year-old had eaten jam. She had. She had eaten a truly historic quantity of jam, and she had then attempted to conceal this by washing her hands, which was, Ilva had to admit, evidence of a criminal mind operating well beyond its years. "I don't smell any jam," Wren said, from underneath the table. "You don't smell any jam." "No." Ilva crouched down and looked at her daughter, who was crouched under the table with the deep, wounded dignity of a woman falsely accused. She had her mother's dark hair, and her mother's stubborn chin. She had her father's eyes, and Ilva had made her peace with that in the way you make peace with weather. "Come out. I'm hiding. You're extremely visible." "I'm hiding a bit," Wren conceded, and came out, and held up her sticky hands to be picked up, which was cheating, and it worked, because it always worked. Lulva carried her out into the front room of the inn, with the child's arms locked around her neck and jam in her hair. And Tamsin looked up from the fire and said, without any particular surprise, she got the jam. I moved it to the high shelf. She is a professional, Ilva said. You cannot simply move things to a high shelf and expect to defeat a professional, and she was laughing. That is the thing that would matter later, and she did not know it yet. She stood in the warm front room of a small inn in a small town, with jam in her hair laughing. And it was an ordinary Tuesday. And she was happy. It had taken her a long time to be able to say that word without flinching. Happy. It had taken the first winter, which was very bad, and the second, which was less bad, and about 1,000 mornings of getting up anyway. But she could say it now, and mean it, and she was not lying to herself, which she would have known, because she has always been able to smell a lie. Little Mabry sat where the pine country ran out and the mountains started, 400 miles from Corin, which was exactly 400 miles more than Ilva had wanted between herself and that place. It was a nothing town. It had a mill and a smith and an inn called the Blue Martin, which Ilva and Tamsin had bought with everything Ilva owned, and everything Tamsin could steal from her brother, and it had, at any given time, about 600 people, most of whom owed the Blue Martin money. And it had a finder. That was what they called her here. Not tracker, finder. Because, in a border town, the things that go missing are not poachers. They are children who wandered up the ridge. They are a herd gone through a broken fence in the night. They are old Halbury, who has forgotten his own name twice now, and walks off toward a house that burned down 30 years ago. Ilva found them, all of them. Every single time, in 5 years, she brought them home. And the town of Little Mabry had quietly, and without any ceremony whatsoever, decided that she was theirs. In the spring she had found the Marrow Boy, 6 years old, gone from the top field at noon. And by dusk there were 40 people on the ridge, shouting his name into the wind, which is the single worst thing you can do. And Ilva had made them all stop and sit down. Then she had knelt in the mud where the child was last seen, and put her face very close to the ground, and stayed there for a long time, while 40 people watched her, and thought privately that she had lost her mind. He went downhill, she said at last. He wouldn't, said his father. He knows the ridge. He'd go up, toward the road. He went downhill, Ilva said, because he was crying, and children who are crying go downhill. She found him at midnight 2 miles down, asleep in the hollow of a fallen pine with a dead rabbit he had been trying to rescue. She carried him back up the mountain herself, and she did not let his mother see her face until she had arranged it into something calm, and she did not tell anybody, ever, that she had followed him for the last half-mile purely by the smell of his fear. Nobody here knew what she had been, nobody asked. That was rather the point of the place. They knew she was a wolf, of course. Half the town was. But nobody in Little Mabry had ever seen the inside of a great hall, and nobody had ever thought to wonder why the finder got very quiet whenever a rider came up the Corin road. Corwin came in at midday with his hands still black from the forge, and stood in the doorway the way he always did, as though he needed permission for his own life. Afternoon, he said. Afternoon. I brought the hinge. You brought the hinge 2 days ago. I brought a better hinge, Corwin said, with terrible dignity, and Wren shrieked with joy and demanded to be thrown at the ceiling, and Corwin, who was the size of a door and had the temperament of a slightly anxious dog, threw her at the ceiling. He was a good man. He had asked Ilva twice. She had said no, twice, gently, and he had accepted it both times, without a scene, which is more than can be said for kings. Sometimes, she wondered whether she was a fool. Then she would go up the ridge at dusk, and stand where the wind came off the mountain, and press her hand flat against her own breastbone, against the cold, silent place where something used to be. And she would remember that a man had cut it out of her, rather than say her name out loud. The stranger came into the Blue Martin, just before dark. He was a plain man in a plain coat, and he ordered a plain meal, and he paid for it. And Ilva knew he was wrong within about 4 seconds of him crossing the threshold, because she was the best nose in the realm and always had been. He smelled of the capital, not of a place, of a house, the old dry paper and cold iron of the record halls of Corin, and under it, Faint, the particular oil that the crown's men use on their blades. Tamsin, Ylva said quietly. Take Ren upstairs. Why? Take her upstairs. The stranger ate his plain meal. He asked no questions. He looked at nobody. He was extremely good at looking at nobody, which is a skill, and which is only ever learned for one reason. Twice he glanced at the stairs. Ylva watched him do it, and something old and cold woke up in the back of her skull and stretched. He finished. He left 3 coins on the table, arranged in a neat row, and at the door, he stopped, and turned, and said, pleasantly, to the room in general, they said there was a woman here who could find anything. Nobody answered him. Nobody in Little Maybury ever answered anything. It was, in its way, the town's finest quality. Is that so? Said Tamsin from the fire, without looking up. That is so, said the stranger. In Corin, they say it. They say a great many things in Corin, Tamsin said. They say the wine is good there. The stranger smiled. He had a very ordinary smile. He inclined his head, exactly the way a small, tidy, pleasant man had once inclined his head to Ylva in an aisle full of strangers, and he went out into the dark. Ylva stood behind the bar with her hand flat on the wood and did not move for a very long time. He had not asked her name. That was the thing. In 5 years, every stranger who had ever come looking for the finder had asked for her by name, because that is how a man finds a person, unless he already knows exactly where she is, and has only come to check that she is still there. She barred the door that night. She had never barred the door. Tamsin watched her do it and said nothing, which is the whole reason Ylva loved her. She went up and sat on the edge of Ren's bed until the candle burned down, listening to her daughter breathe, with one hand resting flat and useless on the cold, silent place in the center of her own chest. 5 years, she thought. 5 years, and not one word, and not one writer, and not one letter. Why now? And in the morning, when the light came gray over the mountains and the frost was on the yard, Ylva was up before anyone, and she came down into the front room with her sleeves shoved up and her hair a disaster. And Ren was already there, sitting on the long table where she was expressly forbidden to sit, singing something tuneless to a wooden horse. And Ylva laughed at her, just a small one, just the ordinary laugh of an ordinary woman on an ordinary morning who has slept badly and is about to make bread. She was still laughing when the door of the Blue Martin opened. She looked up. Reuben of Austria stood in the doorway of her inn, 400 miles from his throne, with the frost behind him and the morning light on his face, and he looked at her, and he saw her laughing. And Ylva watched, from a very long way away, as everything in the Alpha King's face fell apart. Behind her, on the table, entirely unaware, Ren went on singing. There is a thing that happens to a room when an Alpha King walks into it. Treeply, Ylva had felt it 2,000 times. The air goes tight. Every wolf in the place stands up a little straighter without deciding to. It did not happen. That was the first thing she noticed, before the gray at his temples, before the hollows under his eyes, before the fact that he had come 400 miles alone, with no crown, no guard, and no horse that she could hear in the yard. The room did not change. Reuben of Austria stood in the doorway of the Blue Martin, and the fire went on burning exactly as it had, and Tamsin went on stirring the pot, and the air did not go tight, and Ylva's own wolf, which had once come to its feet for this man from 4 floors away, did not stir at all. He was a man in a doorway, that was all. Ylva did not scream, and she did not throw anything, both of which she wanted to do with a violence that frightened her. She simply crossed the front room, put herself between the door and the long table where her daughter sat singing, and said, in the flat voice she used on drunks, "We're closed. Ylva, get out of my house." He looked at her the way a man looks at water after a long time in a desert, which is to say without any dignity whatsoever, and he said, "You laughed. I beg your pardon when I came in. You were laughing." "I have thought about a great many things for 5 years," Reuven said. And his voice was not the voice from the dais. It was worn down to the wood. "I never once thought about that. Not once. That you might be somewhere laughing. Here is what it was like." From the other side of the room, He had rehearsed it 400 miles. And he had rehearsed it, every one of them, the way a man rehearses a thing he does not believe he will ever actually have to say. He had a speech. It was a good speech. He had built it over 5 years, and it opened with the words, "I am not here to ask you for anything." Then the door came open, and there was warmth and wood smoke, and a woman with her sleeves shoved up, and her hair, a disaster, laughing at a child on a table, and every word he owned went out of his head like birds off a roof. She had not withered. That was the thing he had not prepared for. He had allowed himself, in the very worst hours, a small, mean, secret comfort, which was that she was out there somewhere, unhappy, and that her unhappiness was at least a kind of company for his own, and she was fine. She was better than fine. She was standing in a warm room with jam in her hair, laughing, in a life he had no part in and no claim on, and had with his own hands and his own mouth built for her. He had never in his life been so completely and so justly punished by anything. "Tamsin," Ilva said. "Take her up." "Take who up?" Wren said with enormous interest, and slid off the table. And that is how the Alpha King of Austria came to be looking, for the first time in his life, at his daughter. Ilva could not breathe. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, and her whole body ringing like a struck bell, and she watched him look down at the small, dark-haired girl who had wandered out from behind her mother's legs, with jam still faintly in her hair, and she waited. She waited for it, because she was a wolf, and he was a wolf, and there are things you do not have to be told. 5 years she had told herself that this was the one mercy the gods had left her, that he would never see the child, that the world was wide, and Corin was far away, and it would simply never happen. And now, it was happening, and it was taking a very long time, and he was going to know. Reuven crouched down. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Wren, who was afraid of nothing on this earth. "Are you cold?" "Very. You can sit by the fire. But you have to pay. Everyone has to pay. My mother says so." "Your mother," Reuven said, "is entirely right." And he smiled at her. And then he stood up, and he turned back to Ilva. And there was nothing in his face at all. No shock. No suspicion. Not the faintest flicker of a man who has just been struck in the chest by something he cannot name. Nothing. He looked at his own child and he felt nothing. And Ilva stood there and understood, with a slow, creeping horror that started in her spine and went out to her fingers, that Reuven of Austria could not smell her daughter. He could not smell anything. She heard herself say, "Tamsin, upstairs, now." And Tamsin, who had never once in 5 years asked a question at the wrong moment, scooped the child onto her hip and went. And the stairs creaked, and the door above closed, and Ilva was alone in the front room of the Blue Martin with the man who had cut her out of himself. She said, "What have you done to yourself?" He did not answer that. He looked around the front room instead, and she watched him do it, and she knew exactly what he was seeing. 9 tables, a crooked shelf, a stone floor. She had laid herself, badly, in the second winter, when she could not sleep and needed something in this world to be flat and finished, and hers. "You built this," he said. Ilva did not answer. The name on the sign. The Blue Martin, that was the. "I am not going to do this," she said. "Do what?" "I am not going to stand in my own house and explain my life to you," Ilva said. "You do not get that. You gave that up in front of 2,000 people. You do not get to walk in here 5 years later and be curious." He shut his mouth. "Good," she said. "Say what you came to say. And then get out of my town." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I need a finder." Ilva laughed. It came out wrong, jagged, and she hated the sound of it. "Then find one." "There is one," he said. "There has only ever been one." "Then you should not have thrown her out of your hall like slops," Ilva said. And the words were out before she could catch them, and she saw them land, and she was glad. She was so glad. 5 years of dignity and one sentence had put a hole straight through him, and she stood in the wreckage of her own good behavior and felt magnificent for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "The queen is missing." 11 days, Ruvan said. She went out to the summer house at Venik with 6 guards. The guards came back. She did not. There is no body. There is no ransom. There is no trail that any man in my service has been able to follow. And there are 14 days left before her father brings 20,000 wolves across the Severn border to take my head, and he will be entirely within his rights to do it. Then, find her. I cannot find her, Ruvan said quietly. That is what I am telling you. I cannot find anything anymore. He said it without self-pity, which was somehow much worse. Ilva looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the gray in his hair, which had not been there. She looked at the way he stood, careful, like a man carrying something broken and trying not to jostle it. Why are you asking me? She said. Of all the people alive, why would you ever imagine you could ask me? Because I have no one else, he said. Because every man I have sent has come back with nothing, and I have begun to understand why. And because you are the only person in the whole of Austria who has ever had absolutely no reason to lie to me, I have every reason to lie to you. Yes, Ruvan agreed. But you never have. He went to the door. He stopped there, with his hand on the frame, and he did not look back at her, and he said, "The girl, she yours?" Ilva's whole world narrowed to a point. "Yes," she said. "And her father?" And Ilva Vane, the finest nose in the realm, who could smell a lie at 40 paces, who had never in her life told one that mattered, looked at the back of the man who had made that child and said, "He's dead." Ruvan nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. He sounded as though he meant it. Then he went out into the frost, and Ilva stood in her own front room, with her heart going like a hammer, and above her, through the floorboards, she could hear her daughter singing. She said no. She said no. That night. And she said no. In the morning. And she said no with her arms folded in the yard, while he stood there in the sleet, like an idiot who had never learned to come in out of weather. "I am not your tracker," she said. "I have not been your tracker for 5 years. I have a business, and a child, and a life, and you cannot ride up here, after half a decade of silence, and expect me to drop the lot, because your wife has wandered off. She did not wander. I don't care." And that was the trouble with him. It had always been the trouble with him. He did not argue. He simply stood in the sleet and agreed with her, and let the silence do the work, and Ilva could have cheerfully put a knife in him. She went inside, she barred the door, she made bread, badly, and burned it, and Tamsin ate it without comment, and at midday, Corwin came up from the forge with his face grey, and said, "There's men on the Corran road." "How many?" "Camped by the mill. They say they're surveyors." Ilva stood very still. "Surveyors," she said. "They've got a lot of blades for surveyors." She went to the window. She did not need to see them. She had smelled them since dawn, and she had been telling herself, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has built something and does not want to lose it, that she was imagining it. Old dry paper, cold iron, the oil, the crowns men use on their blades. They had not come for the queen. There was no queen within 400 miles of Little Maybury. They had come because a man in a plain coat had gone back to Corran, and reported that the finder was still exactly where she had always been, and whoever had sent him had decided that this was at last a thing worth doing something about. Looked out at the small crooked town that had taken her in without asking a single question, and she thought about 40 people standing on a ridge, shouting a child's name into the wind, and she thought about Tamsin and Corwin and old Hal Bray, and she thought, very clearly, they are not safe while I am in this town. She found Ruvan at the edge of the yard, still standing in the sleet, because of course he was. 3 conditions, she said. Something went through his face that she refused to look at directly. Name them. I work alone. You do not follow me. You do not question me. And you do not put a single one of your men anywhere near a trail I am reading. Second, when this is finished, you go back to Corran, and you never come here again. Not a letter, not a writer, nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Agreed, he said. And the third, the 9 men by the mill leave tonight, Ilva said. All 9. And nothing happens to this town while I am gone. Not a barn, not a dog, not a broken window. If I come back, and one thing in Little Maybury has been touched, I will not go to your council, and I will not go to the law. I will come and find you myself, and you have already seen what I can do when I am looking for someone." Reuven looked at her, and for the first time since he had walked through her door, something in him woke up. Not the king, not the mask. Something underneath it, older and considerably less civilized, and it looked out of his eyes at her with a kind of terrible pride. "Yes, Ilva," he said softly. "Don't," she said. "Don't say my name. You lost that." The 9 men left the mill at dusk. Ilva watched them go from the ridge, counting, and she counted 9. And it did not comfort her in the slightest. Tamsin packed her saddlebag without being asked. She put in bread and salt and the good knife, and then she stood in the doorway, with her arms folded, and said, "Is it him?" Ilva stopped. "I've never asked," Tamsin said. "5 years, I have never asked you one thing. But there is a man standing in my yard in the sleet, who has not taken his eyes off that door since he came through it. And there is a girl upstairs with his exact face. And I am not stupid, Ilva." "No," Ilva said. "You are not. Does he know?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Ilva picked up the saddlebag. "If I come back," she said. She went up to say goodbye. That was the part she had been putting off. And it went the way these things always go, which is to say, badly, and then unbearably well. "Where are you going to find something?" "What? A lady," Ilva said. "She's lost." Wren considered this with great seriousness. "Is she very lost?" "Extremely." "Then you'll find her," Wren said, with the flat total confidence of a child who has never once in her life seen her mother fail at anything, and went back to her wooden horse. Ilva sat down on the edge of the bed rather suddenly. She stayed there for a while. Then she put her mouth against her daughter's hair and said, quietly, so that nobody in the world could hear it, "You stay in this house. You stay with Tamsin. You do not go up the ridge, and you do not open the door to anybody. And I am coming back? Say it," Wren said, half asleep. "Say the other bit." "And I would find you anywhere," Ilva said. "Under anything. Through water. There is nowhere in this world you could go that I would not come and get you." Wren smiled without opening her eyes. Downstairs Corwin was waiting by the door with his cap in his hands, and he did not ask her anything either, and she loved the whole crooked town of Little Maybury so much in that moment that it hurt her chest. "Anything happens here," he said. "Anything at all, I'll stand in that doorway." "I know you will," he nodded. Then he said, "He's a king, isn't he?" Ilva looked at him. "Aye," said Corwin. "To nobody," and put his cap back on. They rode out before dark. The summer house at Venick was 110 miles southeast, and they made it in 3 days, and Ilva did not speak to him, for 2 of them. He did not force it. He rode where she told him to ride, and he stopped when she stopped, and he handed her things before she asked for them, which was a habit he had never lost, and which she found so unbearable that she nearly turned the horse around twice. At Venick, she got down and knelt in the mud of the carriage yard, and put her face very close to the ground, and stayed there. Reuven sat on the step and waited, and said nothing at all, for 2 hours. When she stood up, her knees were soaked and her hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. "Well," he said, "your queen was not taken," Ilva said. He went very still. She got into the carriage on her own 2 feet, without a struggle, without a sound, and she got out of it at the gate, and she walked. She walked, Reuven, 11 paces. And then somebody put a hand on her, and that is where it stops being a walk. Then she went with them, willingly. She went with them, expecting something else. Ilva said, "There's a difference, and it is the whole of the difference." Someone she knew asked her to come, and then, at the gate, she understood. She turned in a slow circle, reading the yard the way another person reads a page. "6 guards," she said, "6 of them, and they never drew. There is not one drop of blood in this yard, and not one blade came out of a sheath. And 6 of the crown's own sworn men let a queen be taken 11 paces from a carriage and did nothing." Reuven's face had gone white. "They came back," he said slowly. "All 6. They came back, and they told the council she was gone from a locked room. Then they lied. Then they lied," he agreed, And Ilva said, "There is one more thing, and you will not like it." She crouched at the gatepost and touched the ground with 2 fingers. "They laid a false trail north," she said. "It is a good one. It is a very good one. It is exactly good enough that 9 hard-riding men would follow it for a week and lose it in the marsh, and come home swearing they had done everything a man could do." She looked up at him, but the horses that carried her went south. Reuven stared at her. "South?" he repeated. "South is nothing. South is pine country, and mountains, and 400 miles of—" He stopped. Presented. Ilva watched him arrive at it, and she watched his hand close slowly on the stone of the gatepost, and she felt the ground tilt very gently under her feet. "South," she said, "is Little Maybury." They rode through the night and did not stop, and somewhere in the small black hours, on a ridge above the pine country with the horses blown and the stars coming out hard and cold, Ilva stopped hers and got down and said, "Now you will tell me." Reuven sat looking at nothing. "Tell you what?" "Everything," Ilva said. "You will start with why a queen is being carried toward a town I have lived in for 5 years, and you will not stop until I understand it. And if you lie to me even once, I will get back on that horse, and I will go home, and I will let your kingdom burn." "I have never lied to you. You told 2,000 people I was a warm thing on a cold road." "Yes," said Reuven. "Then you are a liar." "Yes," he said again and put his face in his hands. "In 5 years, in a war and a famine and a winter that took 1/5 of the city, she had never once seen him do that." "Ozias," he said, into his palms. Ilva did not move. "Chancellor Ozias," Reuven said. "Who is my father's man, and his father's before him, and who has run the treasury, and the council, and the border lords since before I could walk, and who has spent 30 years quietly building a kingdom inside my kingdom, and who came to me in the spring, 6 years ago, with a proposal." He lifted his head. "There is a law," he said. "It is very old and nobody reads it anymore, and it is still, technically, the law. When an alpha king takes a mate, the 2 of them are one animal. That is what the words say. Which means that if you kill the mate, you do not simply grieve the king. You cripple him. A severed alpha is half a wolf. He can be challenged. He can be put down like a dog by any lord with a stomach for it, and the law will call it clean." Ilva's mouth had gone dry. "Ozias explained this to me very kindly," Reuven said. "Over tea. He explained that a king who chooses a woman with no house and no army has made himself a lock with a key hanging next to it. And then he explained that Severin had a daughter, and Severin had 20,000 wolves, and that the council would find such a match extremely reassuring. And I said no." He laughed, and it was a horrible sound. "I said no, and I went to bed. And in the morning, the girl who tasted my food was dead on the floor of the kitchen." Ilva closed her eyes. "It was not meant for me," Reuven said. "That is what I want you to understand. That cup was not brought to my rooms. It was brought to yours. You were out. You were 3 days out at the Vale, tracking that cursed horse thief, and you did not come back until the Friday. And by then they had scrubbed the floor." He looked at her. "He was not threatening my life, Ilva. He was never interested in my life. He wanted my wolf broken, so that his cousins could take the throne inside a year, and there was exactly one way to break it, and she was out at the Vale on a horse in the rain, with no idea." Ilva stood on the ridge in the dark and could not feel her own hands. "Then arrest him," she said. Her voice came out very small. "You are the king. You had a dead girl on your kitchen floor." "I had a dead girl and no proof," Reuven said. "I had a chancellor who has held the loyalty of 9 border houses for 30 years. And I had a council that would have called it a kitchen accident. And I had one guard captain I trusted, who was dead within a month of a fall from a horse he had ridden for 11 years. He stood up. I could not touch him. Do you understand? If I had moved on Ozias with nothing, there would have been open war in the streets of Corinth inside a week, and he would have won it, because he had spent 30 years arranging to win it, and I had been king for 4. So I did the only thing left." He came toward her, and he stopped a long way off, which she noticed. "I made you worthless," he said. The wind came up over the ridge. I stood on that dais and I took everything you were and I broke it in front of the whole kingdom, because a man does not poison a woman who means nothing. Nobody kills a discarded bedwarmer. She is not worth the risk. She is a joke, and a joke can walk out of a city gate in the dark and nobody follows her, and that is what I needed. That is all I needed. That was the whole of it, Ilva said, and the bond. Reuven stopped. Say it, she said. He reached up slowly and pulled his collar aside. There was no mark there. Where a mate mark should have been, high on the side of his throat, there was a scar, wide and white and ugly, the flesh drawn tight and wrong, and Ilva made a sound she did not authorize. A bond is a road, he said. As long as it was open, any wolf who knew what he was doing could have walked it straight to you. Wherever you went, whatever name you took, he would have found you inside a month. So I cut it. I cut it from my side, on the fourth landing of the North Tower, with my own hand. And it is the only thing I have ever done that I would not do again. He let the collar fall. I have not been able to shift since, he said, not once. I cannot scent a man in a room. I cannot tell a lie from the truth. I sit in council, and I listen to men who want me dead, and I cannot smell a single one of them, and I have been ruling this kingdom for 5 years with my eyes and my ears and nothing else. Ilva was crying. She had not given herself permission and she was doing it anyway. You did that, she said, to keep me alive. Yes. Without asking me. Reuven's mouth opened. Without asking me, Ilva said again, and her voice broke wide open, and everything she had held for 5 years came out of her at once. You decided. You stood there, and you decided what my life was worth, and what I could survive, and you never once, not for a single second, considered that I might have chosen. I would have stood with you. I would have stayed, and I would have hunted him, and I would have died in that city with my teeth in his throat, if it came to it, and it would have been mine to choose, and you took it. You took the choice out of my hands, the way you took everything else, and then you called me a warm thing on a cold road, and I believed you. She could not stop. 5 years, she said. 5 years. I have carried the thing you said to me. I have carried it every day. I built a whole life on top of it. I got up every morning, and I made myself into someone who did not need you, and I was proud of it, and it was good. And now you come here and tell me it was a lie, and I am supposed to what? Be grateful. No, Reuven said. No, he said again. He was not defending himself. He was standing there taking it, the way a man stands in rain. I did not come here to be forgiven. There is no version of this where you forgive me, and I have not spent 1 hour of 5 years imagining one. I came because I need a finder, and because he is moving on you, and because whatever I did to you, I will not let him have you. Ilva wiped her face with the back of her wrist, savagely. He is not moving on me, she said. Ilva, think, she snapped. You said it yourself. I am nothing. You spent a kingdom's worth of cruelty making me nothing. Ozias watched you do it. He smiled at me in the aisle. Reuven, I remember his face. So, why in the name of every god would that man take a queen and carry her 400 miles south to a town where a nobody who once warmed your bed is selling beer? Reuven had no answer. She watched him not have one, and she felt the ground go out from under her for the second time in 3 days. Because there was an answer. There was one answer, and it was the only answer, and it was sitting on a long table in the front room of the Blue Martin, with jam in her hair, singing to a wooden horse. What is it? Reuven said. He had gone very quiet. Your face has changed. What is in little Mabry? And Ilva looked at the man who could no longer smell a lie. Nothing, she said. Nothing at all. The storm caught them at the old watchtower on the Pine Road, and they went inside because there was nowhere else, and the door would not shut. And so they sat on either side of a small, bad fire, with the rain coming sideways through the doorway, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Ilva was cold. She had been cold since the ridge. It was not the weather. You should sleep, Reuven said. I don't sleep. Since when? Since a Tuesday 5 years ago, Ilva said. Give or take. He flinched. She had not intended it to land quite that hard, and then she found She did not mind that it had. The fire went down. He got up to build it, and she watched him do it, and she noticed that he did it well, which he had never used to. Kings do not build fires. Somewhere in 5 years, this one had learned. You cook, too, she said. I saw you at Venice. I live alone, Ruvan said, kneeling at the hearth. There is a whole staff of people whose life's work is to prevent me from living alone, and I have defeated them at enormous expense. And Ilva laughed. It was out of her before she could catch it. A short, surprised, unwilling thing, and it went through the little stone room like a bird let out of a box, and Ruvan went absolutely still with a stick in his hand. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was about to, he admitted. Don't. He put the stick on the fire. He sat back down. And then, very quietly, without looking at her, he said, I would like to tell you one thing, and then I will never say it again. Ylva said nothing, which he correctly understood. I have imagined this, he said. Not the queen, not the chancellor, this. A room and a fire and you across from it and no crown and no hall and nobody watching. I have imagined it so many times that I no longer trust myself to know what is real, and I want you to understand that I am aware of how pathetic that is, and I am telling you anyway, because I have run out of things to be proud about. The rain came down, and then it happened. It was very small. It was so small that she nearly missed it, and she has thought since that if she had been anywhere else, if there had been any other scent in that room, any noise, any distraction at all, she would have missed it entirely, and everything after would have gone differently. Under her ribs, in the cold, dead place, something moved. Ylva's hand went flat against her own chest. It was not the bond. The bond was gone. It had been carved out of her on a stone landing, and there was nothing there. There had been nothing there for 5 years. She had checked. She had checked, every single night, like a woman, pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt. But something moved, a thread, thin as a hair, and warm, and reaching. She looked up, and Ruvan was staring at her, with his mouth open and one hand at his own throat, at the ugly white scar, and his face had gone the color of ash. Did you? He said. No, said Ylva. Ylva? Did you feel? No, she said, and stood up so fast the world tilted. Nothing happened. Nothing moved. There is nothing there, Ruvan. You saw to that yourself, and it does not grow back. And I will not sit in a burnt-out tower in the rain and let you tell me that it does. He stood up too. He did not come toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, and his hand was still at his throat, and he looked at her with something in his face so raw, and so hopeful, and so completely undefended, that she had to turn away from it. Right, he said quietly. Of course. Nothing. And she heard what she had done to him. She heard it perfectly. She stood with her back to a man she had just cut, in exactly the way he had once cut her, and she discovered that it did not feel like justice at all. It felt like being sick. She opened her mouth, and the horse screamed. They were both out of the tower before it finished. Ylva first, blade in her hand, and the rain hit her like a wall, and the dark was absolute, and there was nothing in the yard but their 2 horses pulling at their lines, and one shape hanging from the crossbeam of the old stable. A man. He had been dead for some hours. He wore the crown's colors, and his face was the face of one of the 6 guards who had ridden out to Venice with the queen and ridden back without her, and someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure he was found here, on this road tonight. There was a paper pinned to his coat, and the rain had not touched it because it had been folded inside oilcloth by a careful man. Ylva took it down. She turned it over. And there, on the front, in a small, tidy, pleasant hand, was one word. Ylva. She read it by the fire with her hands perfectly steady, which she was proud of for the rest of her life. It was short. It was courteous. It was, in its way, a masterpiece. It congratulated her on 5 years of quiet living. It observed that a woman of her talents had been wasted on a border town. It expressed the writer's sincere hope that she had been happy. Then it said that the Queen of Austria was alive, and would remain so until the 21st day of the month, and that she would be found, when she was found, in the cellar of an inn called the Blue Martin, with the finder's own knife in her, and that Severin would burn Corin to the ground for it and never once stop to ask a question. Then it said, in the second-to-last line, that the writer had taken the liberty of collecting the child. Rouvan said her name. She did not hear him. The last line said, "Come to Emberlow. Bring him. She is 4 years old, and she has your eyes, and I would very much rather not." Ilva. Reuven's hands were on her shoulders. "Ilva, what does it say? You have gone white, what does it?" She gave him the paper. She watched him read it. She watched him get to the second-to-last line, stop, and read it again, and lift his head, very slowly, and she watched the exact moment that the arithmetic of 5 years assembled itself behind the eyes of the Alpha King of Austria. 4 years old, he said. Ilva could not speak. He said, 4. The fire cracked. She has your eyes, Rouvan read aloud, from the paper, in a voice that had stopped working properly. She has your eyes. He would not have written that if she had your eyes. He would have written it if she had. He stopped. He put the paper down on the hearth, very carefully, as though it might go off. She said, "We have to go. Ilva." "Little Mabry first," she said. "He lays false trails. Rouvan. It is the only thing he is genuinely good at, and I am not riding 40 miles to Emberlow, on the word of a man who hangs guards on crossbeams. I've read the room she was taken from, and then I will know." "Get on the horse, our daughter," said Rouvan. Ilva looked at him, and there it was, everything. 5 years of it, standing in a ruined tower in the rain with gray at his temples and a paper in his hand, looking at her. "Yes," she said. Then she went out and got on the horse. They reached Little Mabry at dawn. The door of the Blue Martin was open and swinging, and the front room was wrecked, and Tamsin was on the floor by the hearth, with her hand pressed to her side, and her mouth set in a line, and she was alive, and she was so angry she could barely speak. 9 of them, she said. Ilva. 9. Don't talk. They knew which room. They came in through the yard, and they went straight up the back stair, and they knew which room. Ilva. They never looked. They never. I know, Ilva said. Because she did know. She had known since the tower. She had smelled it the moment she came through the door. Over the blood and the smoke and the broken beer, one scent she had known for 5 years and had never once had to think about, because it was the scent of a man who mended her gate for nothing and threw a child at the ceiling and had never asked her a single question in his life. Corwin was standing in the corner of the room with his cap in his hands. He did not run. That is the part she has never been able to forgive and has never been able to hate him for. He did not run. He stood in the corner of the room he had helped her build, and he waited for her, and when she turned around, he looked her in the face. Ilva, he said, say it. They came to the forge, 3 days back. They said, his mouth was working badly. They said the Wolf King had come to take you south. That he'd take the girl and put her in that place, in that city, and that she'd be base-born in a court full of knives, and she'd be dead inside a year. They said it kindly, Ilva. They said it like men who were sorry, and you believed them. They said if I told them where she slept, they'd have her away safe before he could get his hands on her, Corwin said. And he stopped. He was a big man, and he was coming apart in front of her, and there was nothing left of him at all. I thought I was keeping her, he said. I thought I was keeping you. Ilva stood in the wreck of her own front room, and what she felt was not rage, in the end. She has thought about that a great deal since. It was something much older and much colder, and it had been sitting in her for a very long time. Everybody, she said. Corwin looked up. Every single one of you, Ilva said. Him on a dais deciding what I could survive. Him with a knife in his own throat, deciding I was better off not knowing. Ozias deciding what I was worth. And now you, in my own house, deciding where my daughter sleeps. Her voice did not rise. That was the terrible thing. Not one of you in my entire life has ever once asked me. Corwin was crying. Get out of my inn, Ilva said. And then she turned around and she picked her knives up off the floor. And behind her, in the doorway, the Alpha King of Austria said, very quietly, what do you need? And Ilva said, a fast horse, 40 miles, and the Severan envoy riding 1 hour behind us, close enough to hear what his queen has to say, and far enough back that nobody kills her to stop her saying it. Here is what everybody got wrong about Ilva. And they all got it wrong, every one of them. 4-5 straight years. They thought she was a weapon. Ozias had planned for a weapon. He had 9 men and a fortified keep and a cellar with a door, and he had thought about how a very dangerous woman would come through a gate, and he had arranged for her not to. But Ilva was not a weapon. Ilva was a finder. She went into Emberlow 4 hours before they expected her, on foot, from the north face, up a scree slope that no rider in the world would have attempted, and that no sane man would have watched. She did not look for the door. She got down on her belly on the wet stone above the well shaft, and she put her face to the cold air coming up out of the ground, and she breathed. 400 separate things came up out of that shaft. Old water, rat, rot, 9 men who ate badly, lamp oil, iron, and halfway down, faint and unmistakable, and 4 years old, a child who had eaten a truly historic quantity of jam. Ilva closed her eyes. Then she went down the well. It took her 20 minutes, and it cost her most of the skin on her hands, and at the bottom there was a grate, and behind the grate there was a black flooded passage that had not been used in 100 years. And she went along it on her hands and knees in 6 inches of freezing water in absolute darkness, with nothing in the world to guide her but her nose. And she did not stop once. "There is nowhere in this world you could go," she had said, "that I would not come and get you." She had not been making conversation. She came up through the floor of the old brewing cellar, and she found the Queen of Austria, chained to a pillar with a sack over her head, and she found her daughter asleep in the Queen's lap. Because Audelie of Severan, 17 when she was sold and 22 now, had spent an entire night sitting on a stone floor with a child she had never met, singing to her so that she would not be frightened of the dark. Ilva took the sack off. Audelie looked up at her. And the Queen of all Austria, filthy and chained and 11 days starved, began to laugh and cry at the same time, and she said, "He came. I told her all night. I said, 'Your mother will come.' And she said, 'Here's what happened at Emberlow,' and it was over very quickly." Ilva did not fight 9 men. She was not stupid. She sent a Dalian wren out through the flooded passage with the last of the lamp oil and a knife, and she went up into the keep alone, and at the appointed hour when the Alpha King of Austria rode up to the gate of Emberlow alone and unarmed exactly as he had been instructed, and Chancellor Ozias came out onto the wall to watch him do it. But Ilva was standing 4 feet behind the Chancellor in the dark. The 9 men were in the yard. They were watching the king. "Ozias," she said. He turned around. And to his very great credit, he did not scream. And he did not fumble, and his small, tidy, pleasant face rearranged itself into something almost like delight. "The finder," he said. "On the wall, of course. Where is the Queen?" "Somewhere you cannot reach in time," he said pleasantly. "She is standing in the tree line with the Severan envoy," said Ilva. "Because I put her there an hour ago, and she is telling him your name?" Ozias stopped smiling. And then he ran. It was, in every possible way, the worst decision of his life. He got 400 yards. He got off the wall and down the stair, and out through the sallyport, and into the pine country in the dark, which is a thing that a clever man might do, and which would have worked on absolutely anybody else in the entire kingdom of Austria. Ilva found him in 11 minutes. She came out of the trees behind him without a sound, and she took his legs out from under him, and she put him face down in the wet pine needles, with her knee between his shoulder blades and his wrist bent up to the breaking point, and she leaned down to his ear. "You should not have run," she said. "I find things." They took him back in chains. It was finished by dawn. The Severan envoy had the Queen, alive, unharmed, and extremely talkative, and the 6 guards were in irons, and the 9 men had thrown down their blades in the yard the moment they understood that the woman on the wall had walked up out of a well. And in the grey light, in the courtyard, with the whole thing over, Rouvan came and stood in front of Ilva, and did not touch her. "She is safe," he said. "She's with the Queen. She has not stopped talking." "Good, Ilva." His voice cracked straight down the middle. "Ilva, I have a daughter. Yes, said Ilva, and she watched him wait. She watched him stand there in the mud of that courtyard, with his whole heart in his hands waiting, and she knew exactly what he was waiting for, and she felt it pulling at her, the warm, thin thread under her ribs reaching. And she said, "You'll be a good king." The light went out of his face. "You already are," she said. "You will be a better one now. And you will have your queen, and your council, and your kingdom, and I truly hope, that it makes you happy." "Ilva, but I am going home," she said, "and I am taking her with me." He let her go. That was the thing she had not prepared for. She had prepared for letters. She had prepared for riders, and flowers, and a king's charm arriving in her yard once a week, for a year, and she had built a wall against every single one of them, and stood behind it, with her arms folded, ready. That was the first one, a quiet man with a cart, who mended the front room of the Blue Martin and the back stair and the yard gate, and who would not take a coin, and who said only, "He said you built it yourself the first time. He said you shouldn't have to twice." Then a physician, for Tamsin, who stayed until she was walking. Then nothing. Then, in the spring, a letter. It contained no apology. It contained a legal instrument, signed and sealed, recognizing Reine Vane as a daughter of the royal house of Austria, with every right and every protection that name carried, and stating in plain language that the crown made no claim on her person, her residence, or her mother, and never would. He had made his daughter untouchable, and he had asked for nothing in return. And he had not signed it as her father, he had signed it as king. Ilva read it 4 times, and then she went out and sat on the ridge until it got dark. The letters came after that, not many, once a month, sometimes less. They were the strangest letters she had ever received. He wrote about the grain law. He wrote about a road he was building through the pine country, and asked, in a postscript, whether the northern route was madness, because he suspected it was madness, but his surveyors were all cowards. He wrote about Italy, who had gone home to Severin, and whose marriage he had dissolved by mutual consent and mutual relief, and who wrote to him now as a friend and signed her letters, with an obscene joke. He wrote that he had begun to be able to smell smoke again. Only smoke. Only sometimes, not once, in a year and a half, did he ask to see her. And Ilva answered him. She never meant to. The first one she answered, because he was wrong about the northern route and it offended her professionally. The second, she answered because he had thanked her for the first. And then, it was simply a thing she did. At night, at the long table, after Wren was asleep. She did not say anything that mattered, neither did he. Both of them knew exactly what they were doing. The last letter came in the autumn. It was 3 lines. It said, "I am riding the Northern Circuit next month. The road goes over the ridge above Little Maybury. I will not come down. I want you to know that. I will be there, and I want you to know that I will not come down, because you asked me not to, and because it is the only thing you have ever asked me for." It said, "I have kept every letter." It said, "Be well, Ilva." And that was all. She put it on the table. She sat looking at it for a very long time. Then she got up and went about her day, and she made bread, and it was fine, and she served 9 tables and settled 2 arguments and found a lost goat, and at the end of it, she went upstairs and stood in the dark of her own room, with her fist pressed against her mouth. This was what she had wanted. She had wanted him to stop. She had said so, in a courtyard, in the mud, with everything he had held out to her, in his 2 hands. So why did it feel, exactly, precisely, identically, like standing at the back of a great hall in a good grey coat? The riders came over the ridge, on a Tuesday. Wren saw them first, because Wren saw everything first, and she ran into the front room, and said, "There's men on the hill," and then she said, in the plain and terrible way of a child of 6, "Is it him?" Ilva did not answer. Because it was raining, and they were not moving. The column had gone on. 20 riders. A banner, the whole northern circuit of the crown of Austria, moving away east along the high road exactly as it should. And one man had stopped his horse on the ridge above the town, and got down, and he was standing there in the rain, doing nothing at all. just looking down at a small, crooked town with a mill and a smith and an inn called the Blue Martin. Keeping his word. Dilva stood in the doorway of her own house and watched the Alpha King of Austria stand in the rain on a hill, and she thought, he will stand there until the light goes, and then he will get back on the horse and he will ride away and he will never come here again, because I told him not to. And he will do it. He will actually do it. He would give her up honorably and quietly, and for the rest of his life, and he would never once complain about it, and he would die an old man having asked her for exactly nothing. And Ilva Vane, who had never in her life been given a choice by anybody, understood that she was being given one now. She put on her coat. She went out into the rain and up the hill, and her daughter came with her, because there was no power on this earth that could have stopped her, and the two of them climbed the ridge above Little Maybury, hand in hand, while a king stood at the top of it and watched them come, and did not move a single muscle. He was soaked through. He looked terrible. He looked at Ren, and something in his face broke and mended and broke again. Ilva, he said, I'm sorry. I'll go. I said I'd go. I only wanted to. Be quiet, said Ilva. He shut his mouth. She stood in front of him in the rain, on a hill, with her daughter's hand in hers and her heart going like a hammer, and she looked at the man who had once stood on a dais, in front of 2,000 people, and used her own name on her like a knife. So she gave him his back, and she used it the other way. Ruvan of Austria, she said loudly, into the wind, so that he could hear every word of it, and so could the ridge, and so could the whole crooked town below them, and so could anybody else who cared to listen. His head came up. You are not a warm thing on a cold road, Ilva said. You are the father of my daughter, and you are the only man I have ever loved, and you have been standing on this hill in the rain for 2 hours because I told you to, and you would have stood here for the rest of your life. She was crying. She let herself. I am not asking you to be sorry, she said. You have been sorry for 7 years. I am asking you to come down off this hill and into my house and eat something, because you look like a drowned dog. She watched him try to speak. She watched him fail at it entirely, twice. And then Ren, who had heard quite enough of this, let go of her mother's hand and walked forward and looked up at the enormous, soaking wet man on the hill with the gray in his hair. Are you cold? She said. Ruvan went down on his knees in the mud. Very, he said. You can sit by the fire, said Ren. But you have to pay. Everyone has to pay. My mother says so. And the Alpha King of Austria put his face in his hands and wept, on a hillside, in the rain, in front of his daughter, and his kingdom, and the woman he had thrown away to save. And under Ilva's ribs, in the place where nothing had been for 7 years, something that had been reaching, for a very long time, finally, quietly, took hold. It took a while. After that, it was not a story where anybody rode off into anything. He came down the hill, and he ate 2 bowls of stew, and fell asleep at the long table, with his head on his arms, and Ren drew on his face, and nobody stopped her. He shifted again in the spring. It took 11 months and a bond healer from the Pine Country, and more failed attempts than he ever admitted to, and when it finally happened, it was in the yard behind the Blue Martin at midnight, and it hurt him so badly that Ilva held him afterwards for an hour on the wet stones. Ren saw a wolf for the first time in her life and was profoundly unimpressed. He needs a brush, she said. They were married in Little Maybury, not in Corin. The council had opinions about this, and Ruvan listened to all of them very politely and then did exactly as he liked, which is, in the end, the only good use anybody has ever found for a crown. Half the kingdom came anyway, and slept in barns, and the Blue Martin made more money in 4 days than in the previous 7 years combined, and Tamsin has never once let anybody forget it. Corwin left before the wedding. He wrote to her from the coast, once, and Ilva read it and she wrote back, and what she said in it is nobody's business, and on the night, in the dark,